So this piece is kind of broken up and all over my shop because I'm priming it, and it is quite large. It's 10 feet long. But for the next installment of this video, I'm going to be showing you how I made the two end desks. They're identical, so the process was the same. So I'll show you pretty much how I made one, and you could use that information to make two. The nice thing about the way this is set up now is you could also see what I was talking about by this being 3 modular units that if you wanted to, you could eventually use as separate units, and they're joined by one continuous tabletop. So this right now has primer on it. I'm going to be painting it. The paint I had to order because it was a special color. Once that comes in, this whole thing will be painted and finished. The third video, I'm going to be showing you all the finishing touches, how I finished up the drawers for the desk, as well as how I made the top. So I needed 8 legs to start this process, and I ordered these legs from Rockler. They're poplar legs, and I went through, and depending on our dimensions that we had pre-decided, because this piece has pretty specific dimensions, I went through and marked where all my mortises are going. Now she wants the edges of these to be flush, so the mortises are going to be cheated to the front, but the front panel that has that drawer, the mortises are cheated towards the middle so that you have a rail that goes across the top of the desk to make it structural, but the drawer front can go up to the top of the tabletop, very similar to on the filing cabinet. So then I'm using a mortising machine to do some 3/8 mortises where I marked all those. You don't have to pre-mark your mortises. I did it just because I was making so many of them. On some of these legs there's 4 mortises, on others there's 3, and they're all in different spots, so it's just easy to have the marks on there to keep everything kind of straight in my head. Now you can make a haunched mortise and tenon for this so that at the top you're not removing all that material, but for this sort of desk I didn't think that was necessary, so I just made the mortises go all the way to the top. You could see then I could just move the fence on this mortising machine and make the ones that are more so in the center of the piece. These rails that are going to go across are going to be 3 inches wide. So I already pre-cut down some poplar to length, rough length, and then I'm ripping it down to 3-inch pieces. I wanted this to be a little bit thicker than normal just so that the desk is sturdy, especially since there's no support going across the front. So once I had all of those, I marked where I wanted my tenon to be, which is centered in the piece. And then I rough cut down these boards to final size once I knew what the sizes were going to be. And then I'm going to cut all of my tenons. I have a pretty rudimentary tenoning jig on my table saw. It's basically just a vertical piece of plywood that's attached to a cradle over my table saw fence to cut these tenons. And what you don't see is I always painstakingly cut a perfect first tenon, because if this will cut these the exact same way. So if it's off by even a little bit, when you go to cut it, it'll be proud one way or the other. So I go through and I do a bunch of test cuts to get that tenon perfect. So I set the height and the depth, and then I could repeat all of those cuts. Once that's done, I use a stop on my fence in order to rip off that extra shoulder material. So the mortising jig leaves the mortise a little rough. You could go through twice and really clean it out nicely, but personally I would rather spend the time chiseling it out than going through on the mortising machine, so I just clean it up so those joints fit nicely. You can see how nice that fits in place. And then I could dry fit all of my panels. So this is the short end. And some of these go together a little rougher at first, so I'll kind of make a mental note of which ones and make some minor adjustments after I dry fit this all together. You can see it's a nice tight fit. They fit in there snugly without having to be beaten into place, which is what I like. And I always like these mortise and tenons because this piece of furniture basically holds itself together, and then once you add glue to it, it's twice as strong. So in the bottom portion, and then I could put on the side, and then the top will have another rail across the back, and then that short rail in the front. The short rail in the front is only 2 inches wide because it got a little tricky in the front with the size of the drawer that the customer wanted. You can can see I could hammer that into place, and then this is my rough frame. So then I'm going to have to cut material for all the panels. So usually what I do is I cut a 1/4 inch groove and I put 1/4 inch panels in there. That's kind of what this line designates. But since, like I said, I want this to be a little more structural, I decided to go with 1/2 inch panels. So on the back, I'm going to cut a through rabbet. So usually that panel kind of nestles in place on there, but to get that 1/2 inch panel, I decided to cut it through. You can cut the plywood so that there's a tongue on the plywood that will fit into a 1/4 inch groove, but for this style desk it was just easiest to do it this way, so that's what I decided to do. So I'm going to send all of my pieces through. I have a sacrificial fence on my table saw so I could cut these rabbets. I'm going to send them all through at about half height, and then raise the blade again and send it through again after getting the blade risen to the exact right height so that the panel's flush. So once I had those cuts, I could mark on the legs, because the legs are going to need a groove for that panel as well. So I put those rails in place, I marked the back, and then I marked the front, and then marked how high that panel cut had to go through, because I didn't want it to go all the way through the piece. It would ruin the shoulder of the mortise there. And then I have a 1/2 inch dado stack in here, and you can see I have 2 pieces of tape designating where to lower the piece for the front and then where to raise it once the back of the piece of lumber hits that back edge of the tape. And that is the groove that I get. Now, because it's a circular blade, it's left with a little bit of a curve at the edge, so I just go through, can put my piece in there and mark how high I need to chisel out, and then I could go through and clean up that curve. This is pretty simple work. You could do this cut with a router, but it's just really fast on the table saw. And that is what it looks like flattened out versus this other end here showing still with the curve. So it's just a little bit of material you're removing, just that top edge. And this is it all in place. You can see that rabbet and those grooves, it forms a continuous line around the edge. If these are off from one another, your panels won't fit, especially 1/2 inch plywood, because there's not going to be any give in 1/2 inch plywood. If you're using something like 3/32 or 1/8 inch lumber, sometimes you could tweak it a little bit and get it in there, but not with 1/2 inch. So it's super important you make those cuts accurate. So once those were dry fitted again, I could go through, take measurements, and cut all of my plywood. Like I said, this is 1/2 inch maple veneer ply, cabinet grade plywood, so I could rip it down and then cut it on the radial arm saw. And the radial arm saw is great for making these really deep cuts. So the height of all of the panels are the same, and obviously the width on 2 edges of this is the same, and the width in the back is the same, and you have to account for adding material for the grooves. And then I could dry fit these panels into place. So everything fit together really nicely. I used to use a shop-built mortising jig, and it worked really well for when I used it. But now that I have this I think it's a DeWalt. Yeah, it's a DeWalt mortising jig. It's just, I've noticed that all of these panels, this piece went together almost perfectly. Can remove the sides, and you kind of see I hesitated there. That's when I realized that I didn't account for the depth of the groove in my back panel. I didn't add the 3/4 inch I needed, so it is too short, and I kind of went forward with it anyway because I believe this was a Friday, so I just wanted to see what it looked like together, and then I was gonna have to fix my mistake the next day. So you could see how that panel doesn't fit the edge, and it ended up working out okay, because since the height's the same on all of these, I used that back panel to cut the 2 sides for the other cabinet and then just recut that backer. So once I had all those dry fit in place, I could glue these all together, and I glue these up in stages because I just find it's easier. Especially in the summertime, this glue will set up much faster than in the wintertime, so it's easier to just glue together the 4 edge panels, get them nice and square, let them dry overnight, and then I'll glue the rails to the edge panels. So that's basically what I'm doing here. I'm putting glue in all of my mortises. I personally don't glue the panels to the poplar because the plywood won't really move on you, but the poplar can. So if the poplar shifts and it's glued to that plywood, there is a chance it could break the plywood. So I don't add, especially thinner plywood. This thicker stuff's probably not a huge deal, but just to be on the safe side, I don't glue it. I check my diagonals. If they're a little off, you could hammer one side or the other. Hammer onto the side towards the shorter side is usually what I do, and then once they're accurate, I clamp them together, and I did all 4 of these, the 4 side panels. So then I set up some doors in the middle of my shop. I had to level them all so I could set this whole thing up. That's kind of the pain with my shop, nothing's level. And then I could start putting this together. Before I glued it together, the back top rails I put 2 dados in. You could see I have a stop set up so that those dados are going to be perfect, and that is just to add a structural support from the front to the back and something else to attach the plywood top to. So then this is just putting glue in those mortises. Could add my back panel. You can see how it's so much more convenient having these doors leveled on the floor in order to get all this level. And then the backer, once again, add glue. You could see now better how those dados are going to function from the front and the back. And this cabinet, the inner dimensions are about 36 inches. The outer dimensions on each is 40 inches wide. So those 2 dados are about 12 inches in from either edge, in the front and the back. And then I can once again add the front. So then this, I'm going to make sure I have it butted up against the filing cabinet just to make sure those edges are going to be square, but I also make sure that it's square. Same method, measuring my diagonals will tell me if it's square, and I do that before I set it up. I did end up adding a couple clamps to these. I don't think I filmed it, but I did clamp these and let them dry overnight, and then after this one I glued the other desk the exact same way. So then the next day I came in and cut these. I think they're 2 inches, and I just hammered them into place, and those are the supports I was talking about that I used those dados for. They were kind of a tight joint, so I really had to apply pressure on these to get them to fit. So if that front edge is a little bowed or a little off, it won't really matter because the drawer is going to hide it. So then visually the customer wanted a rail at the bottom that you saw at the bottom of the drawer. So that's what this piece is. I could have added this in the beginning, but I didn't really know exactly how I was going to do these drawers because they're so thin. So I decided to add it after the fact, and you could see I'm making sure that rail will fit in between the top and the bottom, and it just barely fits based off the clearance that we were going for, which is 25 inches off the bottom. So in order to put the rails for the drawer slides, because that front rail I'm just going to glue into place and then probably put a screw in it afterwards. To put rails on the sides in order to attach my slides, I'm just cutting shallow open mortises, and I'll put lap joints on some poplar, and that's how I'll fit those drawer slides in there. Now this also would have been much easier to do with this unglued, but once again I didn't know exactly how I was planning on doing this when I glued it up, so I just chiseled them out after the fact. So this is the popper that's going to go on the edges, which I'll attach the drawer slides to for the skinny drawer. And since I have that mortise cut out in the table legs, I'm going through and cutting a lap in that poplar, and you can see now how it fits in the edges. This is gluing in those rails. And like I said, this will be for the drawer slides, so I have a nice flush surface. So if your cabinets aren't square, mounting the drawers for this, because these are once again wide drawers, and wider drawers are harder with racking. Parts that aren't square, it's kind of maximized over the length of the piece, and it makes life a lot more difficult. So like I said, this bottom rail, it's not structural or anything like that, it's just aesthetic. So I'm just gluing it into place, and then I will go through and probably put a screw in it afterwards.